The morning started like any other in the Lakota camp. Children played near the river while their mothers prepared the morning meal. Old men sat around small fires, sharing stories and smoking their pipes. The autumn air was crisp, and everyone could feel winter coming soon. Nobody knew this would be their last peaceful morning together. Lakota had been up early, checking on the horses with his younger brother. At 25, he was known as one of the best riders in their tribe. His sister Ayana was feeding her baby son when she called out to him, laughing about something funny the little one had done. The baby was only 3 months old, with the darkest eyes and the softest hair. Everyone in the camp loved that child. The attack came without warning. One moment, Lakota was helping his brother fix a broken saddle. The next, he heard the thunder of horses and the sharp crack of rifles. Blue-coated soldiers poured into the camp from 3 directions, their faces hard and angry. These weren't the usual patrol soldiers who sometimes passed through for trading. These men had come to kill. Get to the children. Lakota shouted to anyone who could hear him over the gunfire. He ran toward his sister's lodge, his heart pounding like a war drum. All around him, his people were falling. Mrs. Running Bear, who had taught him to make arrows when he was small. Young Crow Feather, who could make anyone laugh with his jokes. One by one, the people he had known his whole life were cut down. The soldiers weren't trying to capture anyone. They weren't demanding surrender. They were shooting at everything that moved. Old grandmothers trying to shield their grandchildren. Teenage boys who had never held a weapon. Even the camp dogs weren't safe from their bullets. Lakota reached his sister's lodge. Just as a soldier on horseback rode up to it, the man had his rifle raised, pointing it right at the entrance where Ayana was hiding with her baby. Without thinking, Lakota threw himself at the horse, pulling the soldier down. They fought in the dirt, rolling and punching until Lakota managed to grab the man's own knife and end the struggle. But when he looked up, breathing hard and covered in blood, he saw more soldiers coming. There were too many of them. The camp was lost. His sister appeared at the entrance of her lodge, her face white with terror, the baby crying in her arms. "Brother, you have to run," she said, her voice shaking. "Take my son, please. You're the only one fast enough to get away." Lakota wanted to argue. He wanted to stay and fight beside his people. But he could see she was right. The soldiers were everywhere now. The smell of smoke filled the air as they began setting fire to the lodges. If someone didn't save the baby, the child would die with everyone else. Ayana pressed her son into Lakota's arms. The little one was warm and soft, still crying from all the noise and confusion. "Find the woman with kind eyes," his sister whispered urgently. "Grandfather used to tell stories about her. She lives where the 3 trails meet in the wooden house by the big pine tree. She will know what to do." Before Lakota could ask what she meant, a bullet whistled past his ear. Ayana pushed him toward the back of the lodge where his horse was tied. "Go now, don't look back." Those were the last words his sister ever spoke to him. As Lakota rode away with the baby clutched against his chest, he heard her scream cut short by gunfire. His heart broke, but he couldn't stop. The child in his arms was crying, and staying would mean both of them would die. The horse ran like the wind, carrying them away from the burning camp and into the thick forest. Behind them, black smoke rose into the clear autumn sky. The sound of gunfire grew fainter, but Lakota could still hear it echoing in his head. Every shot might have been another member of his family, another friend, another piece of his world disappearing forever. As they rode deeper into the wilderness, Lakota realized he was hurt worse than he had thought. The fight with the soldier had left him with cuts and bruises, but there was something else. His chest felt wet and warm. Looking down, he saw blood seeping through his shirt. A bullet had found him during the chaos, but he had been too focused on saving the baby to notice. The child had stopped crying and was looking up at him with those big dark eyes, so trusting, so innocent. He didn't understand that his mother was gone, that his whole world had just been destroyed. All he knew was that someone was holding him, keeping him safe and warm. Hours passed as they traveled through country Lakota had never seen before. His grandfather had told him stories about these forests, about the trails that connected different tribes and the trading posts where people from all backgrounds came together in peace. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, after what he had witnessed. The baby was getting hungry. Lakota could tell by the way he was starting to fuss and move his little hands around. Soon the child would need milk, and Lakota had no way to provide it. The thought made him push the horse harder, even though he was getting weaker with every mile. As the sun began to set, snow started falling. Big, heavy flakes that stuck to everything and made it hard to see very far ahead. Dakota's vision was getting blurry too, partly from the snow and partly from losing too much blood. His hands were getting numb, making it difficult to hold the reins properly. The horse was tired as well. The poor animal had been running hard all day, carrying both of them through rough terrain without rest. Lakota could feel the horse's strength giving out just like his own. They couldn't go much further like this. That's when he saw it. A tiny yellow light flickering through the falling snow and the dark trees. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. But as they got closer, the light got brighter and more real. It was coming from a window, a house. Someone was home. The wooden cabin sat in a small clearing, surrounded by tall pine trees. Smoke was coming from the chimney, and warm light spilled out of the windows onto the snow. It looked exactly like his grandfather's stories, the house where the three trails met, marked by the biggest pine tree in the forest. Dakota's horse stumbled and nearly fell. The animal was at the end of its strength, just like its rider. With the last bit of energy he had left, Lakota guided them toward the cabin. His vision was going dark around the edges, but he held tight to the baby, making sure the child stayed warm and safe. As they reached the front of the house, Lakota heard the sound of a door opening. A woman's voice called out something he couldn't quite understand. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "Find the woman with kind eyes." The horse stopped moving and stood there, swaying slightly. Lakota tried to climb down, but his strength was gone. The world was spinning and everything was getting dark. The only thing that mattered now was the tiny life in his arms, his sister's son, the last piece of his family, the future of his people. As consciousness left him, Lakota felt himself falling. But somehow, even as he collapsed into the cold snow, he managed to keep the baby safe, holding him close to his chest with the last of his strength. The child's soft breathing was the last thing he heard before everything went black. Margaret O'Brien had been stirring a pot of stew when she heard the sound that made her blood run cold, hoofbeats, slow and unsteady, but definitely coming toward her cabin. She quickly moved away from the window and reached for the rifle her husband Sean had taught her to use before he died. Living alone in the wilderness meant being ready for anything. Traders sometimes stopped by, and they were usually friendly enough, but there were other kinds of visitors too. Men who thought a woman alone was an easy target. Men who took what they wanted and left nothing but trouble behind. Her 6-month-old daughter, little Grace, was sleeping peacefully in her wooden cradle near the fireplace. Margaret glanced at her baby, then back at the door. Whatever was coming, she had to be ready to protect them both. The hoofbeats stopped right outside her front door. Margaret held her breath, listening. She could hear heavy breathing, but it wasn't human. It was a horse, and it sounded like the poor animal was about to collapse. Then she heard something that made her heart skip a beat, a baby crying. For a moment, she couldn't move. A baby? Out here in the middle of a snowstorm? That didn't make any sense. But the crying continued, weak and desperate, mixed with the sound of the dying horse's labored breathing. Margaret crept to the window and carefully pushed aside the curtain to peek outside. What she saw made her gasp and nearly drop her rifle. A man sat slumped on a horse that was clearly at death's door. The man looked like he might be from one of the local tribes, but it was hard to tell in the falling snow and dim light. What she could see clearly was the blood covering his clothes and the small bundle he held. Protectively against his chest, the bundle was moving. The baby's cries were getting weaker, which scared Margaret more than anything else. She had been a mother for 6 months now, and she knew what a hungry, cold baby sounded like. This child was in serious trouble. As she watched, still trying To decide what to do, the man began to slide sideways off his horse. Margaret realized he was unconscious, maybe dying, but even in that state, his arms were wrapped around the baby, protecting it from the fall. That's when her motherly instincts took over completely. She threw down the rifle and rushed outside into the cold night air. The snow was coming down harder now, and the wind was picking up. If she didn't act fast, both the man and the baby would freeze to death right there on her doorstep. Hey, can you hear me? She called out, but the man didn't respond. Up close, she could see he was young, maybe in his 20s, with long black hair that was matted with blood. His breathing was shallow, and his skin was pale from blood loss. But his grip on the baby never loosened, even though he was unconscious. The horse finally gave up and collapsed, breathing its last breath right there in Margaret's yard. The man fell with it, but somehow, miraculously, he managed to twist his body so that he hit the ground first, cushioning the baby's fall with his own body. Margaret knelt down in the snow beside them. The baby was barely moving now, his little lips blue from the cold. She could see it was a boy, maybe 3 or 4 months old, with dark hair and the most beautiful eyes she had ever seen. But those eyes were starting to close, and that terrified her. She had to make a choice, and she had to make it fast. This man could be dangerous. For all she knew, he could be a warrior from one of the tribes that were fighting with the army. Taking him into her house could put her and Grace in danger. But looking at that tiny baby, so close to death, she knew there was really no choice at all. Margaret scooped up the baby first, wrapping him in her shawl to keep him warm. He was so light, so fragile. She could feel how cold his little body was, and it reminded her of how Grace felt when she was born early and nearly didn't make it through her first night. Getting the man inside was much harder. He was tall and solid, and she was just a small woman who had been living on simple food for too long. But fear for the baby's life gave her strength she didn't know she had. She grabbed the man under his arms and pulled him through the snow, step by step, leaving a trail of blood that the falling snow quickly covered. By the time she got him inside her cabin, Margaret was exhausted and the baby was barely breathing. She quickly laid the man down on the rug in front of the fireplace, then turned her attention to the child. His skin was ice cold, and his breathing was so shallow she had to watch closely to see his little chest moving. Grace had woken up from all the commotion and was starting to fuss in her cradle. Margaret looked from one baby to the other, and suddenly she knew exactly what to do. Without thinking twice about it, she sat down in her rocking chair, opened her dress, and put both babies to her breast. The feeling was strange at first. Grace was used to nursing, but the little boy didn't seem to remember how. His mouth was so cold it was almost numb. Margaret gently stroked his cheek and whispered to him the way she did with Grace when she was having trouble eating. "Come on, little one," she said softly. "You can do this. You need to eat so you can get strong again." Slowly, the warmth of her body and the smell of milk seemed to wake something up in the baby. He began to nurse weakly at first, then with more strength as his body remembered what it needed to do. Margaret felt tears running down her cheeks. As she watched the color start to come back into his little face, Grace didn't seem to mind sharing at all. In fact, she seemed curious about the new baby, reaching out with her tiny hand to touch his dark hair. It was as if she understood, even at 6 months old, that this little boy needed help, while the babies nursed. Margaret kept one eye on the unconscious man lying on her floor. She could see he was still breathing, but he had lost a lot of blood. His clothes were torn and stained, and she could see at least 3 places where bullets had hit him. How he had managed to ride so far in that condition, she couldn't imagine, but what amazed her most was how he had protected the baby. Even unconscious and dying, his first instinct had been to shield that child from harm. That told her more about his character than anything else could have. After both babies had nursed and fallen asleep, Margaret gently laid them in Grace's cradle together. They looked peaceful lying side by side, the little boy's dark hair contrasting with Grace's light brown curls. For babies who had never met before, they seemed remarkably comfortable with each other. Now Margaret turned her attention to the wounded man. She had learned a lot about treating injuries when Sean was in the army, and later when he was hurt in accidents around their trading post. She knew this man would die if she didn't do something soon. Working by candlelight, she cut away his bloody shirt and began cleaning his wounds. 2 of the bullet wounds had gone all the way through, which was actually good news. The 3rd bullet was still lodged in his shoulder, and she would have to dig it out if he was going to have any chance of surviving Dot as she worked, Margaret found herself talking to the unconscious man the same way she talked to Grace when she was upset. "You're going to be okay," she said, though she wasn't sure if that was true. "That baby is safe now. You did good getting him here." "Real good." The man's face was strong and kind even in unconsciousness. She could see he was probably handsome when he wasn't half dead from blood loss. But more than that, there was something peaceful about his expression, as if saving the baby had been worth whatever pain he had endured. Margaret worked through the night, cleaning wounds, removing the bullet, and stitching up the worst cuts. The man never woke up, but his breathing got a little stronger as the hours passed. By morning, she was exhausted, but she thought he might actually make it. When dawn broke, she checked on the babies again. They were both sleeping soundly, curled up together like they had always been siblings. The little boy's skin was warm now, and his breathing was deep and regular. Whatever had brought him to her door, he was going to survive. Margaret sat back in her chair and looked around her small cabin. Yesterday, it had been home to just her and Grace. Now it sheltered a wounded warrior and an orphan baby, all of them depending on her to keep them safe and alive. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or how she was going to explain this to anyone who might come around asking questions. All she knew was that when that man had arrived on her doorstep, bloody and broken, but still protecting an innocent child, she had seen something that reminded her why Sean had always said people were basically good at heart. The storm outside was still raging, which meant they were all stuck together for now. Margaret looked at the sleeping man and whispered, "I don't know who you are or where you came from, but you're safe here. All of you are safe here." For 3 days, Lakota drifted between life and death like a leaf floating on water. Sometimes his breathing would get so shallow that Margaret thought he was gone, and she would lean close to check if his heart was still beating. Other times, he would mutter words in his own language, his body burning with fever as he fought battles that existed only in his fevered mind. Margaret barely slept during those first few days. She moved between caring for the wounded man and nursing both babies, who seemed to sense the tension in the house. Little Grace would cry whenever Margaret left her side for too long, and the native baby, whom Margaret had started calling Joseph after her late father, would only settle down when he was close to Grace. The strange thing was how the 2 babies took to each other. Margaret had worried that Grace might be jealous of sharing her mother's milk with another child, but instead she seemed fascinated by her new companion. They would lie in the cradle together, Grace reaching out to touch Joseph's dark hair while he would grab onto her tiny fingers with his small fist. On the morning of the 4th day, Margaret was changing Joseph's makeshift diaper when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was quiet, just barely a whisper, but it was definitely a human voice. She looked over at the man lying near the fireplace and saw that his eyes were open for the first time since he had arrived. Those eyes were the darkest brown she had ever seen, and they were looking around the cabin with confusion and what might have been fear. When his gaze fell on her holding his nephew, Margaret saw him try to sit up quickly. The effort made him wince in pain and fall back down, but his eyes never left the baby. "He's safe," Margaret said softly, the same way she would speak to a wounded animal. "The baby is safe. You both are." Lakota stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to figure out if she was real or just another fever dream. Margaret could see he was trying to understand where he was and what had happened. She knew he must be remembering the attack on his village, the desperate ride through the snow, and collapsing at her doorstep. Dot moving slowly so she wouldn't startle him. Margaret carried Joseph over to where Lakota could see him better. The baby was clean and warm, wearing one of Grace's outgrown gowns. His cheeks were pink and healthy, and he was making the soft cooing sounds that happy babies make. When Lakota saw how well the child looked, his eyes filled with tears. He reached out with a shaking hand to touch the baby's face, and Joseph immediately grabbed his finger and held on tight. The relief in Dakota's expression was so deep that Margaret had to wipe her own eyes. "My sister?" Dakota asked, though his voice was so hoarse she could barely understand him. Margaret didn't need to speak the same language to understand what he was asking. She shook her head sadly, and Dakota closed his eyes as if the news was a physical blow. For a moment, the only sounds in the cabin were the crackling of the fire and Grace babbling to herself in her cradle. "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, even though she knew he might not understand the words. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Over the next few days, as Dakota grew stronger, they began to communicate in ways that didn't require sharing a language. Margaret would point to things around the cabin and say their names in English, and Dakota would repeat them back in his careful, accented voice. In return, he would teach her words in Lakota, especially words related to the baby. Margaret learned that the baby's real name was Chayton, which meant falcon in Dakota's language. But she had gotten used to calling him Joseph, and somehow the two names seemed to fit together. He was Chayton to his uncle, Joseph to Margaret, and to little Grace, he was simply the warm, soft presence who shared her cradle and her mother's attention. As Dakota's strength returned, he began helping around the cabin in small ways. At first, it was just feeding the fire or folding the clean cloths Margaret used for the baby's diapers. But gradually he took on more tasks. He would sit by the window and watch for any signs of danger while Margaret tended to the children. He learned to prepare the simple meals they shared, and he even figured out how to make Grace laugh by making funny faces at her. The winter storms kept them trapped inside for days at a time, and during those long hours they began to truly understand each other. Margaret learned that Dakota's sister had been his only remaining family after their parents died in a previous attack years before. The baby was all that was left of his bloodline, the only piece of his world that had survived the massacre. Tako, in turn, began to understand Margaret's story. Her husband Sean had been killed not by Native Americans, as many people assumed, but by the same type of soldiers who had destroyed Dakota's village. Sean had believed in peaceful trading with all people, and some of his fellow settlers had seen that as betrayal. One night, men wearing army uniforms had come to their cabin. They had shot Sean and left Margaret for dead. Only she had survived by hiding in the root cellar. This shared experience of loss created a bond between them that went deeper than words. They were both survivors, both people who had lost everything except their determination to protect the innocent lives in their care. Margaret found herself looking forward to the quiet conversations they had in the evenings after both babies were asleep. Dakota would tell her stories his grandfather had shared about the old days, when different tribes and settlers sometimes lived peacefully together. Margaret would share memories of Sean and their dreams of building a life based on fairness and kindness rather than fear and hatred. One particularly cold night in January, both babies came down with fevers at the same time. Margaret was terrified, remembering how many children didn't survive their first winter on the frontier. She and Dakota took turns holding the sick babies, trying to keep their temperatures down with cool cloths and making sure they continued nursing even when they felt too ill to eat. It was during that long, frightening night that Margaret realized something had changed in her feelings toward Dakota. She had started out helping him because it was the right thing to do, but now she genuinely cared about him as a person. When she saw him holding Grace, singing softly to her in Lakota while tears ran down his own face, she felt something warm and protective bloom in her chest. Dakota seemed to be experiencing similar feelings. Margaret caught him watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite read. When she was nursing both babies, he would sit nearby and make sure she had everything she needed: water, food, a warm blanket. He began calling her by a Lakota name that meant woman with a good heart, and the way he said it made her feel appreciated in a way she hadn't felt since Sean died. The babies recovered from their illness, but the experience had bonded all four of them even more tightly. Together, Grace began reaching for Dakota when she wanted to be held, and little Chayton would calm down faster for Margaret than for anyone else. They had become, in every way that mattered, a family, But even as they grew closer, they all knew this arrangement couldn't last forever. Spring would come eventually, and with it the return of travelers on the trading routes. People would start asking questions about the native man living in Margaret's cabin and the dark-haired baby she was raising alongside her own daughter. One evening in late February, as they sat by the fire watching the babies play together on a blanket, Dakota brought up the subject they had both been avoiding. "When the snow melts," he said quietly, "people will come. They will not understand this." He gestured around the cabin, encompassing their little family. Margaret nodded, though her heart ached at the thought. "I know, but we still have time. A few more weeks, maybe a month." "I have been thinking," Dakota continued. "My grandfather told stories of our people who went north, beyond the reach of the soldiers. They found peace there, a place where they could live without fear." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. "They're talking about leaving." "I must think of Chayton's future," Dakota said, looking at the baby who was happily chewing on his own toes. "Here, he will never be safe. People will always see him as a threat, no matter how young he is." Deep down, Margaret knew Dakota was right, but the thought of losing both of them felt like losing Sean all over again. These two people had brought life and purpose back into her world. Without them, the cabin would feel empty and cold, no matter how well she heated it. "What if we all went north?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself with the suggestion. Dakota looked at her with amazement. "You would do that? Leave your home, your life here?" Margaret looked around the cabin that had been her whole world for the past 2 years. Then she looked at Grace, babbling happily as Chayton grabbed at her fingers, and at Dakota, whose presence had filled the lonely spaces in her heart. "This isn't really my life anymore," she said softly. "My life is sitting right here in this room. My family is here. Home isn't a place, it's the people you love." For the first time since she had known him, Dakota smiled. It was a real smile, one that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. In that moment, Margaret saw not just the wounded warrior who had collapsed on her doorstep, but the man he had been before tragedy struck his world. The first signs of spring came in early March when Margaret noticed the icicles hanging from her roof starting to drip during the warmest part of the day. It should have been a happy time. After months of being trapped by snow and cold, the world was finally waking up again. But for the little family in the cabin, the melting snow meant their time together was running out. Dakota had grown strong over the winter months. The bullet wounds had healed into pale scars, and his body had filled out again thanks to Margaret's cooking and the peaceful rest he had gotten. He could chop wood now without getting winded, and he had even started hunting small game in the forest around the cabin to add fresh meat to their meals. The babies had grown too. Grace was sitting up on her own now and trying to crawl, while little Chayton had learned to roll over and was starting to show interest in the solid foods Margaret was beginning to feed them. The two children were inseparable, crying when they were apart for too long and sleeping curled up together like puppies. Margaret watched them playing on the floor one sunny afternoon and felt her heart break a little. They didn't know that their world was about to change again. To them, this cabin was the only home they had ever known, and the four of them were simply a family. They didn't understand about the hatred and fear that existed in the world outside their door. The first real test came on a warm April morning when Margaret was hanging laundry outside to dry. She heard horses approaching and felt the familiar stab of fear in her stomach. But these weren't the uncertain hoofbeats of someone lost or injured. These horses moved with purpose and authority. "Soldiers," Dakota said quietly from behind her. He had appeared at her shoulder without making a sound, the way he always did when danger was near. 6 of them. "They're still far away, but they're coming straight here." Margaret's mind raced. They had planned for this moment, but now that it was actually happening, she felt paralyzed with fear. "The root cellar," she said quickly. "You know what to do?" Dakota nodded and squeezed her shoulder briefly before disappearing back into the cabin. By the time the soldiers rode into the yard, Margaret was alone outside. Calmly taking down the dried clothes as if she didn't have a care in the world, the leader of the patrol was a young officer with a thin mustache. and eyes that looked like they had seen too much violence for someone so young. He dismounted and walked toward Margaret with the kind of confidence that came from always being the one with the most weapons. "Morning, ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison. We're looking into reports of Indian activity in this area. Have you seen anything unusual lately?" Margaret kept her expression neutral even though her heart was pounding. "Indian activity? No, I can't say that I have. It's been a quiet winter, just me and my baby girl here." As if on cue, Grace started crying from inside the cabin. Margaret excused herself and went to get her, hoping the soldiers wouldn't follow. But Lieutenant Morrison was right behind her, his curious eyes taking in every detail of her home. That's when Margaret saw something that made her blood turn to ice. Little Chayton was sitting in Grace's cradle, looking up at the stranger with his big dark eyes. There was no way to hide him or pretend he wasn't there. "That's a fine-looking boy you have there," the lieutenant said, but his voice had changed. It was sharper now, more suspicious. "Indian features, I'd say. Dark hair, dark skin. Where did you say his father was?" Margaret's mouth went dry, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was the moment she had been preparing for all winter. "His father was my late husband's brother," she said, picking up Chayton and holding him protectively. "Mexican fellow. Died of fever last fall, so I've been caring for the boy ever since." The lie came out smoothly, and Margaret was surprised by how natural it sounded. Lieutenant Morrison studied both babies for a long moment, and Margaret could see him trying to decide whether to believe her story. "Mexican, you say?" The lieutenant walked closer, and Margaret could smell the tobacco on his breath. "Funny thing is, we had reports of a Lakota warrior heading this direction after that business up north last autumn. Riding with a baby, the survivors said." Margaret felt sweat forming on her forehead despite the cool spring air. "I wouldn't know anything about that," she said. "Like I told you, it's been quiet here all winter." One of the other soldiers had dismounted and was walking around the cabin, looking for tracks or other signs of visitors. Margaret prayed that all traces of Dakota's presence had been covered by the winter snow and spring rain. "Mind if we take a look around?" Lieutenant Morrison asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Just to be sure everything's safe for you and the little ones." Margaret couldn't refuse without seeming suspicious, so she nodded and stepped aside. The soldiers searched through her small cabin, looking in every corner and behind every piece of furniture. One of them even checked the loft where she stored her winter supplies. All the while, Margaret stood near the door holding both babies, trying to look like a worried but innocent widow. Grace seemed to sense the tension and stayed unusually quiet, while Chayton watched the strange men with alert eyes that seemed far too knowing for such a young child. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the soldiers finished their search. They hadn't found any trace of Dakota, who was hidden in the root cellar beneath a trapdoor covered by a heavy rug and Margaret's wooden chest. "Everything seems to be in order here," Lieutenant Morrison said, though he still looked suspicious. "But I'll be honest with you, ma'am. If you are hiding anything or anyone, it would go better for you to tell us now." Margaret met his gaze steadily. "Officer, I'm just a widow trying to raise 2 babies on my own. I've got nothing to hide and no reason to lie to you." The lieutenant studied her face for another long moment, then nodded to his men. "All right. Boys, let's move on. But we'll be patrolling this area regularly from now on, ma'am. For your protection, of course." Margaret watched them mount their horses and ride away, not allowing herself to relax until they were completely out of sight. Only then did she rush back into the cabin and move the chest aside to let Dakota out of his hiding place. He emerged from the root cellar covered in dirt, and breathing hard from the stress of listening to every word that had been spoken above his head. "They believed you?" he asked. "I think so," Margaret said, though her hands were still shaking. "But they'll be back, and next time they might not be so easy to fool?" That night, after both babies were asleep, Margaret and Dakota sat by the dying fire and talked about what they both knew had to happen. The world outside their cabin was not ready for their kind of family. Maybe it never would be. "I could take Chayton and leave tonight," Dakota said quietly. "Head north like we talked about." "You and Grace would be safe then." Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. And what about us? What about what we've built here together? Dakota reached over and took her hand. Over the months, small touches like this had become natural between them, though they had never spoken about what they meant. What we have is real, he said. But keeping it might cost all of us everything? Then we all go north together, Margaret said firmly, like we planned. Are you sure? Dakota asked. Really sure? Once we leave here, there's no coming back. You'll be giving up your home, your life, everything familiar. Margaret looked around the cabin that had been her whole world for so long. Then she looked at Dakota, whose presence had brought warmth and purpose back into her life. She thought about Grace and Chayton, who didn't care about the color of each other's skin or the languages they spoke. They just loved each other simply and completely. My home isn't this building, she said. My home is wherever my family is. And my family is sitting right here with me. They spent the next few weeks planning their journey north. Dakota knew the routes his grandfather had described, paths that would take them through wilderness areas where they were unlikely to encounter patrols or settlements. Margaret began quietly packing their most essential belongings, keeping only what they could carry without slowing down their travel. The hardest part was deciding what to leave behind. Margaret had to abandon most of her furniture, her dishes, the quilt her mother had made for her wedding. But she carefully packed the few precious things that mattered most, a daguerreotype of her and Sean on their wedding day, Grace's first. Shoes, the wooden rattle Dakota had carved for Chayton during the long winter evenings. They decided to leave at night, when they would have the best chance of getting away without being seen. Margaret would ride her horse while carrying Grace, and Dakota would carry Chayton on his back in a cradleboard he had made from willow branches and deer hide. On their last evening in the cabin, Margaret stood in the doorway looking out at the forest where she had lived for 3 years. This place had seen her greatest happiness with Sean and her deepest grief after his death. It had sheltered her through her pregnancy and Grace's birth, and it had been the scene of the miracle that brought Dakota and Chayton into their lives. Regrets? Dakota asked, coming to stand beside her. Margaret thought about it honestly. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known to travel into an uncertain future with a man from a... The night they left the cabin, Margaret felt like she was saying goodbye to her old life forever. They traveled under the cover of darkness, following deer trails and creek beds that Dakota knew would hide their tracks from anyone who might try to follow them. Grace rode quietly in Margaret's arms, while little Chayton seemed to enjoy the gentle swaying motion from his secure spot on Dakota's back. The journey north took them 3 weeks of careful travel. They moved mostly at night, and rested during the day in hidden spots deep in the forest. Dakota proved to be an excellent guide, finding fresh water and safe places to camp while avoiding all the main roads, where they might encounter other travelers. Margaret had never seen country so wild and beautiful. Rolling hills covered with thick forest gave way to crystal-clear lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors. At night, when they made their small, hidden campfires, the stars seemed close enough to touch. It was nothing like the civilized world she had known, but there was something magical about it. The babies adapted to their traveling life better than Margaret had expected. Grace seemed fascinated by all the new sights and sounds, pointing at birds and reaching for wildflowers as they passed. Chayton was content as long as he could see his uncle's face and hear his voice singing the old Lakota traveling songs that helped pass the long hours. When they finally reached the area where Dakota hoped to find his people, Margaret's heart was beating fast with nervousness. What if the community didn't want to accept a white woman and her child? What if they saw her as an enemy or a threat? She had given up everything to come here, but that didn't guarantee she would be welcome. The first sign they were close came, when Dakota spotted smoke from cooking fires rising above the trees. Then they heard children's voices calling to each other in Lakota. Dakota's face lit up with joy and relief when he realized they had found what they were looking for. The community was bigger than Margaret had imagined. About 40 families had settled in a beautiful valley beside a clear river. Their homes were a mixture of traditional lodges and small log cabins, showing how the people were adapting to their new life while keeping their old traditions alive when the lookout spotted their small group approaching. Word spread quickly through the settlement. People came out of their homes to see who was arriving. Margaret felt dozens of curious eyes studying her and Grace, and she held her daughter a little tighter. An elderly man with long gray braids and kind eyes stepped forward to greet them. This was Chief Matu, the leader of this peaceful community. He and Dakota spoke in rapid Lakota for several minutes while Margaret waited nervously, understanding only a few words here and there. Then Chief Matu turned to Margaret and spoke in careful English. Dakota has told me your story, he said. How you saved his nephew's life and opened your home to them both. You are welcome here, White Mother. Any woman who would risk everything to protect a child has a place among us. Margaret felt tears of relief running down her cheeks. She had been so afraid of being rejected, of discovering that their journey had been for nothing. But the warmth in the chief's voice and the accepting faces around her told her that they had finally found what they were looking for, a place where love mattered more than the color of your skin. The community helped them build a small cabin near the river, close enough to the other families to be part of the group, but with enough privacy for their unique situation. Margaret learned that several other mixed families lived here too, native men who had married white women, and even a few white men who had been adopted into the tribe and married native women. As the months passed, Margaret discovered that this new life was everything she had hoped it would be. The people were kind and welcoming, always ready to help when someone was in need. The children, including Grace and Chayton, played together without any thought about their different backgrounds. They were just kids being kids. Margaret learned new skills from the other women: how to tan hides, how to preserve meat for the winter, how to make medicines from forest plants. In return, she taught them some of the cooking and sewing techniques she had learned from her mother back east. Everyone had something valuable to contribute. Tako thrived in this environment too. He became one of the community's best hunters and scouts, using his skills to help keep everyone safe and well fed. But Margaret noticed that he was happiest during the quiet evening hours when they would sit together outside their cabin, watching Grace and Chayton play by the river while the sun set behind the mountains. One evening in late summer, as they watched the children splashing in the shallow water, Dakota took Margaret's hand and asked her something he had been thinking about for months. "Margaret," he said quietly, "would you consider becoming my wife? Not just because we live together and raise the children together, but because I love you and want to spend my life with you." Margaret looked at this man who had brought so much joy and purpose back into her world. She thought about everything they had been through together, the long winter in the cabin, the dangerous journey north, the challenge of building a new life in a strange place. Through it all, he had been kind, patient, and devoted to both her and the children. "Yes," she said simply, "I would be honored to be your wife." Their wedding was celebrated by the whole community. It combined traditions from both their cultures, native rituals that honored the earth and sky, mixed with Christian prayers that Margaret remembered from her childhood. Grace and Chayton, now walking and getting into everything, served as the world's cutest wedding party. As the years passed, their little family grew. Margaret and Dakota had 2 more children together, a daughter they named Hope and a son they called River. Grace and Chayton grew up thinking of themselves as full brother and sister, never questioning why they looked different from each other. But the most amazing part of their story was still to come. When Chayton turned 16, he came to Margaret and Dakota with a request that surprised them both. "I want to go back south," he said. "Not to leave forever, but to start a ranch near where you used to live, Mother Margaret. I want to build a place where families like ours can exist without having to hide." Margaret felt her heart swell with pride. This young man, who could have grown up bitter about losing his birth parents and his original tribe, had instead chosen to use his experiences to make the world a better place. "It won't be easy," Dakota warned his nephew. "There are still people down there who won't accept what we represent." "I know," Chayton said. "But I also know there are people like Mother Margaret who will. People who believe that love is more important than fear." So, in 1892, Chayton headed south with Margaret and Dakota's blessing. He had learned everything he could about ranching from the other families in their community, and he had saved enough money from selling furs and crafts to buy a small piece of land. The property he chose was perfect, a beautiful valley just a day's ride from where Margaret's old cabin had stood. He built a ranch house that combined log cabin construction with native design elements, creating something that was uniquely his own. Within a few years, the Ranch of the Two Rivers, as Chayton called it, became known throughout the territory as a place where people of all backgrounds were welcome. Native Americans, white settlers, Mexican vaqueros, and freed slaves all worked together on the ranch, sharing their skills and learning from each other. Margaret and Dakota moved south when they got older, wanting to be close to their son and to see the dream he was building become reality. Grace, now a young woman, chose to marry one of the ranch hands, a kind Mexican man who loved her gentle spirit and didn't care that she had been raised by a Native American stepfather. The ranch became more than just a place of business. It became a symbol of what was possible when people chose love over fear, understanding over hatred. Families from all backgrounds brought their children there to see living proof that different cultures could not just coexist, but could create something beautiful together. Margaret lived to be an old woman, surrounded by children and grandchildren who came in every shade from pale white to deep brown, speaking a mixture of English, Spanish, and Lakota. When visitors asked her about her unusual life, she would always give the same answer. "It all started with one choice," she would say. "A man arrived at my door with nothing but love for a baby in his arms. I could have turned him away out of fear, or I could help him out of love. I chose love, and it gave me the most beautiful life I could have ever imagined." Dakota lived to be nearly 80, and every morning until the day he died, he would stand outside their house and look out over the valley where so many different kinds of families had found peace and acceptance. He never forgot the night he rode through the snow with his nephew in his arms, desperate and dying, with nowhere else to turn. "Sometimes," he would tell his grandchildren, "the worst moments in your life lead you to the best ones. You just have to be brave enough to keep going and wise enough to recognize love when it finds you." The Ranch of the Two Rivers continued to thrive long after Margaret and Dakota were gone. It became a place that proved what was possible when people looked past their differences and saw the humanity they all shared.